Hi everyone. I just got this in the mail yesterday and I'm just getting around to opening it up. This is a new boring head that I got from Shars, and I thought it might be interesting to show kind of a side-by-side comparison between this, which is an imported boring head, and my Criterion boring head, which is the kind of the name brand that everyone clones. For those of you not too familiar with boring heads, the way they work is this part slides right here, and you've got three holes that you can use. You have these two, so for smaller holes you can put it right there in the middle. Larger holes you can do that, and for really big holes you can have it sticking out of the side. So for even a 2-inch boring head like this, you can actually bore a pretty large hole with it. I wouldn't take very heavy cuts if you had a boring bar sticking out that far, but you could easily do a 6 or 7-inch hole with this boring head. So this is actually their combo set that they sell that has everything that you're going to need to get started with a boring head. It's got the boring head itself, it's got the shank, it's got all of your Allen wrenches, it's got these indexable carbide insert boring bars that come with inserts in each one. And then you've got the Torx wrench to change out the inserts if you need those. One thing you should be aware of is the shank is actually loose in the package. I don't know if that's normal or if this one was just happened to be loose. So you can see the boring head screws on. In the action of cutting, the boring head is actually going to be tightening on this shank. But you should still probably put a little bit of retaining compound on there and maybe put this end in your mill spindle, use your spindle lock, and then use a strap wrench on this to try to tighten it up as much as you possibly can. Let's talk for a minute about all these screws that you see on the boring head. These three right here are just for tightening the boring bar in the holes. So obviously the boring bar goes in like that, and you would tighten that. Again, you use this middle one for smaller bores. You can put it through there for larger ones, and then with this boring bar it would actually have to be on the other side. The insert would have to be on the other side. Otherwise if you had it like this, you'd have to run it in reverse and it might unscrew from the arbor. You've got another size of screw for this. This is the gib, and you can see the boring head is split right here by the dovetail. So these two side ones are used to just adjust the tension on this gib so that it feels good. The tension is not too loose or too tight. So once you get your tension adjusted, you don't have to move these screws at all. Now the middle one is what you use as a lock. Once you've made your adjustments on this dial, then you would go ahead and lock down the middle screw so the dovetail can no longer slide, and that keeps it as rigid as possible under the force of a cut. Each mark on the dial is 1/1000th of an inch. It does not say on diameter on this boring head. It usually does say 1 division equals 1/1000th of an inch diameter. So I'm going to have to actually test that under a cut and see if this reads on the diameter or the radius. If it reads on the radius, then that means if you moved it 1 division, 1/1000th of an inch, it would actually take 2/1000ths of an inch off of the hole. I'll test that out and let you know later in the video. The adjustments are all made right here, and in general what I do when I'm boring something is I've already got this set at 0, and I'll just get it where it's going to actually take some material off and it's at a convenient number. That way I can make my pass, measure it. From there I can say, okay, well I've got 100 thousandths to go for my diameter, and I'll be able to move my dial accordingly. It's a lot harder when you start on some random tick mark in between numbered lines. So if possible, I'll start my cuts on 0 or at least on some numbered line. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is my Criterion boring head. Which again, this is the one that everyone seems to copy, and it says 1 division equals 1/1000th on diameter. It does not say that on my Shars boring head, but basically what that means is that if I move one division here, it actually only moves it over a half a thousandth. So it actually removes 1,000th off the diameter. That's very handy when you're dealing with a bore, because you're measuring the diameter of the bore, and if you've only got 20 thousandths to go, it's super convenient to be able to just move 20 thousandths on the dial and know that you're going to be right there. As far as a side-by-side comparison to my Criterion head, the Criterion is maybe slightly smoother in doing the adjustment with the dial, but it's really not by much. I mean, this is very smooth. I've run it back and forth a few times, and it feels really nice, and that's a pleasant surprise. Because usually you would think cheap import, it's going to feel like it's got sand all in it, and it really doesn't. It's very smooth, and I'm quite impressed by that. So the set comes with 4 different lengths of boring bars, all the way from a little short one that's maybe about 2 inches long up to this guy, which is about maybe 3. This is a 2-inch head, so it takes half-inch boring bars. Of course, if you get a 3-inch, it would take a different size. I think that one's 5/8. I think it's really nice that the set comes with these indexable ones, because the brazed carbide ones, eventually they're going to chip, and you're going to either have to resharpen them or buy a new one, especially if it chips really badly. So this is really nice. I think that's a nice touch. So like I said, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison between this one and my Criterion boring head. So I just popped a couple of holes. I think these are 15/16 holes in a piece of scrap, and I'm going to use the same boring bar in each head and go ahead and bore out these holes a little bit, different depths of cuts, and hopefully you'll be able to see in there enough that you can see what the surface finish is like. And I'll give you some extra little tidbits there about things I'm experiencing that obviously you're not going to be able to experience through the video. Okay, so here we are. I'm about to take my first cut, and I just wanted to show you a little bit of the setup on this bar. The size hole that I drilled is kind of in a sweet spot of crappiness here, because it's you got to have it set really far over one way for the middle hole and really far over the other way for the side hole. So I'm just going with the middle hole. Either way, the mass of the bottom is going to be offset quite a bit. For this reason in particular, you never really want to run boring bars super fast. I'm going to run this one at 660 RPM, the lowest speed in the high range on my mill. Since my stock is only 3/16 of an inch thick, I'm just going to use the shortest bar that's in the set. And again, I'm going to use the same bar in each boring head. So what I've done is adjusted this so that the boring bar should actually make a light cut. And I've also placed it to where 0 is at the witness mark on the dial. That way, when I take this cut and I measure, I'll be able to say, okay, I'm so many thousandths away from whatever my goal is. And remember, after you make your adjustment, you need to make sure to tighten up this middle screw. Again, that acts as a lock on the gib. That just keeps it a little bit more rigid. Now I know there's a lot of mills out there, and not all of them are going to be Bridgeports or Bridgeport clones, so I'm not going to get into the mechanisms of how to set up for power downfeed, because that's going to vary by machine, and people with mill drills or other brands of mills may not have the same controls, so that's a little beyond the scope of this video. In the interest of full disclosure, though, I will say that the power downfeed mechanism on my Bridgeport doesn't, in the strictest sense, work anymore. What I mean by that is I screwed something up and I haven't gotten around to fixing it yet. So what I'm going to be doing on this is feeding the knee up in order to make this cut, and I'll use the power feed on my mill. So that cut's really nice and smooth. I like that finish, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a measurement on that hole, and then I'm going to test to see if this cuts on the radius or on the diameter, because that's a big difference, and it's one you'll need to know. So I used a telescoping gauge and a micrometer to make the measurement on my bore, and I came up with 970 thousandths and 2/10. Now, I used a telescoping gauge because it's a lot more accurate than using a pair of calipers. So if you've got any kind of tight tolerance whatsoever, you really don't want to use calipers. They're just not very accurate on the insides of bores. If you don't know how to use a telescoping gauge, I've got a video of that and I'll put a link to it in the description. So what I'm going to do now is move this dial 10/1000ths of an inch. And this is going to tell me, after I take this next cut, whether this dial reads on the diameter or on the radius, because it's not marked. If it reads on the diameter, it would usually be marked with the diameter symbol, which is a large O with a slash through it. I'm going to loosen up the lock there, that middle screw right there. And I'm just going to move 10/1000ths of an inch on the dial. There we are. Now, if this actually reads on the diameter, then I should only take 10/1000ths off of the entire diameter, so only 5/1000ths off of each side. If it reads on the radius, meaning that 10/1000ths actually moved the tool over 10/1000ths of an inch, I'll be taking 10/1000ths off of this side of the hole and 10/1000ths off of that side and increasing it by 20/1000ths. So let's take a peek. That is a really nice smooth cut. I like the finish that I'm getting quite a lot. I had to move over so I can actually get the telescoping gauge in there, but I have the whole location set on my digital readout. If you don't have a digital readout, then you probably don't want to be doing that. You want to just drop the knee down as far as you need to. That's just a little more time consuming. So it looks like the dial actually reads on the radius on this head, because I'm just shy of 990 thousandths right now, and before I was at 970 and I had moved 10/1000ths on the dial. That's a consideration you'll have to take into with a radius reading dial, because if you were going for 1 inch on this bore and you were at 990 thousandths, well, you've got 10/1000ths to go, but that means you have to divide the difference by 2, so you would only have to move this 5/1000ths. It should work equally well as a diameter reading dial, it's an extra step. You're going to have to break out your calculator. You should honestly have that out anyway. I'm actually going to go ahead and take one more cut on this, and just to see how easy it is to get to exactly my target dimension. So I'm going for 1 inch. I moved the dial accordingly, and we'll see how close I get. Alright, again, even on a light cut, it's a very nice finish. By the way, what I'm doing here is I'm going to move the table over just a little bit, since this is my last pass, and then move the knee down. That way I'm not going to get a drag mark on the bore. Alright, and I got pretty much right on 1 inch. I might be a tenth under. Yeah, so that's not too bad at all. It shows that the head actually cuts what it says it's going to cut, so that's very nice. Now this wouldn't be a very thorough video at all if I didn't try a heavy cut, so I'm going to take 50/1000ths off the diameter, so it's actually only going to be 25/1000ths on the dial. And don't forget to lock your gib. Still got a really nice finish in there. I mean, typical for a roughing cut with the boring head. So overall this is performing quite nicely. So I'm going to take one last cleanup pass on this just to get a good surface finish again, so it's fair to compare between the Char's head and the Criterion head after everything's done. So it looks pretty decent. Let's go ahead and switch over to the Criterion head. So I'm going to do the same test with the Criterion head, so it's side by side. I have the same boring bar. In the interest of fairness, I've went ahead and switched the insert to a fresh corner, because that could definitely affect your surface finish. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I've got a light cut first just to establish where I am, and then I'll measure and see how far I need to go to 1 inch, and I'll see what I can do to get this right to 1 inch, just like I did with the Char's head. Then I'll also go ahead and take some heavy cuts and compare the two surface finishes. And then lastly, I'll take one light cut just like I did over here. That way, hopefully I can get it on camera what the surface finish looks like after half a dozen cuts. with the same insert. The surface finish between the cuts looks pretty much identical, and honestly that's less to do with the boring head and more to do with the fact that I have the same boring bar in there. So that's not really much of a surprise. So let me go ahead and take a measurement and see where I am. I've only got about 9 thousandths to take off, so this will be another really light cut before I get to 1 inch. Just like the Char's head, this screw right here is your lock. You don't touch the other ones. And then we'll take my adjustment here. Now, one big advantage to the diameter reading dial is you can just go right to the mark that you need for your final cut. In this case, I needed about 8.5 thousandths, and it's very easy to split that thousandth and get reasonably close. When you're dealing with the radius diameter dial, that gets to be a little trickier because, of course, you're already dividing your cut in two in order to get there. And then it's not as easy to split hairs with it because the adjustment is coarser. So I ended up maybe a tenth over here. Yep, that looks right. So they perform equally well in that regard. Of course, that could just be me. So let me take some heavy cuts. This will be 50 thousandths off the diameter, just like I did with the Char's head. So again, the surface finish on that roughing cut was pretty similar to the Char's head. And again, same cutting tool, so that's not that much of a surprise. Okay, so that's 3 roughing cuts. I'm going to do 2 20 thousandths finish passes here. Okay, last finish pass here. So here they are side by side. You may or may not be able to see it on camera. I'd say the Criterion surface finish is slightly better, but I'm not entirely sure that's got anything to do with the head. More that by the time I finished these cuts, the insert had a bit of a built-up edge going, so I'm not real sure that's conclusive. The insert corner on the Criterion head doesn't seem to have that built-up edge going on. Overall, I'd say I'm pretty happy with how the Char's head performed. I mean, the cuts were smooth, the surface finish was nice, there's no chatter. As far as everything else, the fit and finish on the head is quite nice, and it's a nice little kit to buy. I mean, you've got everything you need. There is one thing that I find slightly annoying with this. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but the numbers on the dial go the wrong way. When you're adjusting this head, of course you've got your holes right here, so you're adjusting the head outwards this way. So in order to do that, the numbers really should go up counterclockwise, so we should have 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. And instead we have it the other way around. So you're counting backwards on this dial, which, again, it's not a deal breaker, and it's definitely something I can live with, but it's one of those things that just makes the tool slightly difficult to use. It adds a mental step in there, if you know what I mean. You know, the numbers are just laser engraved, so maybe when they contact their supplier and order the next set, they can have them flip that around so the numbers go the right way. Anyway, I hope this helps with any questions you've got on the Char's boring head, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.